Hello, everyone. Today I would like to start with a little experiment. This silence you've just felt, that's among the most common and most uncomfortable experiences in higher education. I've studied at universities in 3 different countries. I did my undergraduate degree in Greece, master's in Germany, and PhD in the United Kingdom. I've had the pleasure and fortune of delivering lectures in the UK and in France. All of them European countries whose education systems at least slightly differ, and yet the silence is universal. When we talk about silence in the classroom, we often think it can take many different forms, but most often we relate it to students disengaging. So naturally, what we do is try to reverse that. We try to make students engage. This is what happens when a professor asks a question. Deafening silence that both students and professors dread. So, what we try to do nowadays is we add interactive tools, gamified questions, and participation apps. All of them great, wonderful approaches, and yet somehow the silence remains. So, maybe silence isn't the problem. Silence is just a response, a perfectly appropriate response to the education system we've created. Because the issue isn't student engagement per se, but the kind of engagement, the kind of participation our system actually rewards. Within this framework, what we are dealing with is not silence by accident. Instead, what we have in front of us is silence by design. You see, most students are actually highly engaged, just not with learning, but with figuring out how to first survive and then succeed in an education system that, at its core, is transactional. A system where getting the right answer is more important than thinking out loud. A system where it's safer to stay quiet than be wrong in public. And over the years, it is us, the educators, that we kind of cultivate this silence. If students from an early age witness that their responses will determine their grades will determine any future learning opportunities. And it's eventually these opportunities that will shape their chance of getting a well paid, well respected, secure job, then does it really surprise us that students choose to play it safe by staying silent? Picture a seminar room. Have you ever noticed a student or classmate of yours trying to stay safe, beginning a question with a disclaimer? Something along the lines of, this may be completely wrong, but, or this may sound naive, or my personal favorite, one that I've used and will still use myself countless times, sorry if this is a stupid question. Sorry if this is a stupid question. Students arrive with curiosity, with questions, with a natural desire to understand. But very quickly, they learn, because we teach them, to run a second calculation. Not just what do I want to ask or what would I respond, which is natural, but always coupled to what will this cost me if I'm wrong? And this approach might be sensible in exams, but when you generalize it, when you internalize it, then it drowns the classroom in deafening silence. Now, if we aim for louder classrooms, if we want the students to speak up, and I believe we do, then we might need different rules. Rules where being wrong is still visible, but under the right conditions, not costly. For a stronger classroom, and I would argue even more importantly, for stronger future scholars and professionals, uncertainty is not a failure. To be more precise, acknowledgement of the uncertainty is not a failure, but instead a central, fundamental component of critical thinking. And both for the educator and the student alike, perhaps the most valuable voice in the room is not the correct answer to the question, but I don't know the answer, but that's what I'm thinking about it. That's how I'm reasoning based on my current knowledge, my current understanding. This perspective of reason thinking, of acknowledging the uncertainty, belongs at the very center of the active classroom we aspire to build. Because again, I don't think this deafening silence that we experience and dread, I don't think it is a sign of students failing to participate. Too often in life, we fixate on the symptoms, but miss the underlying cause. And I believe this might as well be yet another instance of this behavior. Perhaps the real question is not how to engage students out of their silence, but what does an engaged educator actually look like? At some point along the way, education began to confuse, to blend delivery with teaching. Delivery of important information, but the problem is students do not engage with information, no matter how exciting my 80-slide bullet point filled presentation might be. So what do students engage with? This is the question that begs our attention. What do students engage with? Do me a favor, for a moment, forget students, forget educators, forget classrooms. Think of having coffee with your favorite friend. Would you remain engaged if suddenly they pulled out their deck of slides and for the next 20 minutes read facts out loud at you? Regret all your life decisions that led to that very moment? Probably. But remain engaged? Almost certainly not. You stay engaged because they are interesting, because they ask questions and they adjust in real time to your needs, because sometimes they challenge your thinking and other times they expand it. Because you can see them thinking out loud in real time, telling you a story they genuinely care about. And students are no different. So how about we stop treating them as passive, prospective recipients of the information we carry? How about we start approaching the classroom not just with what material do students need to pass their exams, but instead ask, what about this topic, this subject, makes me, the educator, come alive? What fascinates us? What does the textbook say, and where does the textbook stop? What does the current literature tackle? What are the open questions, the still active debates? And if you go further back, when you were a student, what was the mystery, the problem, the unresolved open question that was so interesting that convinced you that this topic was worth your lifetime? If we are not excited to be entering the classroom to teach, how can we expect students to be? Now, all of us in this room likely and fortunately, hopefully, you name it, have different interests, different paths. I will not try to guess yours, but I can definitely tell you about mine. Falling in love with my current subject didn't happen overnight, and it actually came considerably late. The first spark came from our high school biology teacher, who did something remarkably simple. Don't get me wrong, of course, his primary objective was to prepare us for our final exams. In the Greek education system, this will actually determine which universities you may enter. But in the meantime, he also asked questions even he himself could not answer. Questions like, what is a thought, biologically, molecularly speaking? What is a memory? What is consciousness? Thought-provoking questions that stayed with me long after the class had ended. And it was not long before I had a plan. I made my decisions. My brain would study the brain. So a few years later, I found myself in a biology degree, finishing up with most of the coursework, applying for what at the time looked like the perfect neuroscience research lab, getting accepted, getting excited, and on day one, newsflash, there's currently no brain project available for you. Instead, you will be studying the optic nerve. Now, for those outside of neuroscience, the optic nerve is essentially the cable that connects your eye to the brain. So there I was, aiming for the mastermind, the center of it all, and somehow ending up with a cable. Now, you might be already and correctly guessing it. I was disappointed at first, deeply, in fact. But before taking any actions, I decided to give it a go, see what it was all about. And I got incredibly fortunate because my supervisor didn't simply describe the project, the literature, the goals, and timelines. Instead, she made me see what was fascinating about it. That this optic nerve, this very cable making vision possible, can regenerate after injury in some organisms, but not humans. And I was hooked. Reading in preparation for this project, reading some more, learning more about these complex neural circuits that are packed in a tiny space at the back of our eyes, making them less like cameras and more like miniature, very sophisticated biological computers. How is this computer structured? How does it function? What does it compute and tell the brain about? And what does it discard, never to be seen? How such a complex tissue evolves in the first place? And you see, I think this is the point. Great educators don't simply deliver what students think they need. Great educators introduce, expose, guide students to something they themselves find interesting, to something that the students could never know they would fall in love with. Education was never meant to be transfer of information, let alone in this day and age where information is more and more accessible every single moment. If students are to still come to the classroom, and this is a big if, then it will be for something far more genuine, for something far more human in the end. Creative and critical thinking, intellectual honesty, acknowledging the uncertainty, curiosity, and excitement. You see, silence might appear as a problem, but I don't think it is one. Silence is simply waiting for something worth speaking into. So let's offer it. Thank you.